became very common, especially amongst sophisticates who had not been early on the lab leak issue, to declare, what does it matter? We're stuck with this virus now. Let's just deal with it. And the answer is actually few things matter more. The obvious reason is that to the extent that this is the product of a laboratory accident, knowing how that could possibly have happened so that we can prevent it is essential. But that's obvious. What I think is not obvious is how much harm was likely done by that route. And this is why we have to get this right. So, couple points. One, I believe, and I hope that we are ultimately able to get past all of the people who want to prevent an honest exploration. I believe that what we had was a brief period of time after SARS CoV-2 emerged in the world in which we really could have driven it to extinction, just as SARS CoV-1 effectively is extinct, right?
It seems to have driven itself to extinction.
Right. It didn't have the goods to keep going. And the question is, could we have delivered SARS-CoV-2 sufficient disadvantage in transmitting if we had gotten to it early and had taken the politics out of it? Could we have driven it to extinction? And I believe what we now know suggests that we probably could have, right? Or that failing that, we could have driven it to a state of extreme rarity where it's effectively extinct, like rabies in the First World. So if that is true, if what happened was, however this thing emerged into the world, let's assume the best. Let's assume it was research, that it was well-intentioned research rather than dual-purpose weapons research. Let's assume they were trying to figure out, they were really afraid of a pathogen getting into the world of a particular nature. They wanted to study it so that they would be ahead of the game when it happened, and they goofed and it escaped, right? That's still a terrible story, and I believe likely the pathogen never would have made the jump. No pathogen like the one that they were looking at would have made the jump and become a pandemic. So the point is, everything that happens negative as a result of that jump having been made with human assistance goes on the bill of the people who made the error in judgment. But
before you go, which is part of why I think it's so important for the messaging coming from those people and the people whose side they're on to convince the world that it has a zoonotic origin. Basically, it furthers, they could not be responsible for something of zoonotic origin, but it also helps keep the population in fear. Oh my God! At any moment in a world that is populated as we are, where we're constantly going into wilderness areas and running into animals, scary animals, then at any moment we could have another one of these things. We'd better keep things clean. We'd better trust the authorities. We'd better, get the public health policy, and what the WHO is working on right now is ridiculously scary. And it, they are actually playing on people's fear that that this entire situation has created in order to move forward a, authoritarian mandate that potentially has the capacity to undermine sovereign governments.
This goes squarely back to what we discussed last week with the fact that the mechanism of procuring grants has turned all sorts of people that we need to do objective science into salesmen. They don't even necessarily understand that that's what they've become, right? It is so reflexive. And so in effect, there is a section of each of the grants that goes towards such research that says something akin to, as the human population expands, we are coming into more and more contact with wildlife, and wildlife is being pressured to blah, blah, blah. That is going to result in pathogens that normally circulate amongst wild animals, making a zoonotic jump to people, at which point, boom, and then you come up with some really crazy level of fear about what type of pathogen could suddenly emerge and not be controllable, and therefore why it is absolutely essential that every God-fearing, mask-wearing, grant-giving agency has to deliver a huge amount of money to these people who are the only ones to study the pathogen before it leaps out of a cave and gets us all.
Yeah, because what will probably be obvious but might not be known to people is that every grant application that I have ever seen. And I saw a ton of them back when I spent a year working with the grant agency, University of California at Santa Cruz, many years ago, but have since seen and heard about many, many others, is that, yes, they are supposed to be assessed on their scientific merits, but there is a section of every single one. And as I remember it, actually many grant applications begin and end with versions of that same section. And that section is basically explain why you deserve money, which is not the same as explain why this is good science.
Well,
and so hopefully there is good science in the stuff that is being funded, but the decision to fund is based in part, and it's got to be largely, given that it's bracketing almost every grant application, what is it about your work that demands funding now, which means increasing the sense of urgency is more likely to get you funding.
Right. And so it effectively is smoke and mirrors boilerplate. And the basic point is either the people reviewing the grant are in on why this isn't exactly true, but they're not going to call it out because they're in the same business, or they can't see through it because they don't have the expertise that would tell them why that's a bullshit story. Right. Human beings expanding and coming into more and more contact with wildlife, bullshit. Right? Now it happens there are more people, and it happens we are backing the wild farther and farther away, but people coming into contact with wildlife is the entire history of people, right? Which means most of the things that can make an easy jump have done it.
A higher proportion of the human population was always in more contact with wildness than the proportion of the human population that is in contact with wildness is now. Right.
And viewers may be interested to go back to my Unheard essay, where I, as a former bat biologist...
This is a different one than you referenced earlier.
Yeah. I, as a former bat biologist, go through the question, at the point that COVID emerges into the world, I then have to wonder if being in contact with bats is enough to unleash a pandemic like this. Could I have accidentally done it when I was in contact with bats? And the answer is very likely not. That this is actually a difficult evolutionary jump, and that there, you have lots of people, you have thousands of people studying bats at any one time. We're not constantly causing pandemics. Why is that? And the answer is because the thing that they say at the beginning of those grant applications about the danger of this happening on any given Tuesday, right? That's bullshit designed to get the system to spit out money.
That's right.
And so, okay, in light of all that, you've got the bullshit designed to get the system to spit out money. It spits out money to fund a reckless kind of research that is very likely to do exactly the thing that nature is not well poised to do, right? It's very likely to unleash a pathogen into the world. Yeah, that's
the one. Is it this one? Okay.
So
you might just, Zach, let Dad keep talking, but just put it on the screen for a moment and I'll post in the show notes too. Go for it.
So in effect, you've got a difficult evolutionary leap that a pathogen would have to make in order to become a human pandemic. Then you have humans who are clever, but not that clever, proposing to do exactly the thing that will make it a small evolutionary leap, right? They're proposing to use trampolines and catapults to get the thing across the gap to become capable of creating a pandemic, on the basis of the absurd argument that in order to know what to do about a pandemic, we're going to have to create something that's capable of making one, which of course runs the risk that the thing is going to leap into the world at any moment, because lab accidents are not uncommon at all. And so, okay, so then the question is, well, what about the people, frankly, like Sam Harris, who said, Sam wasn't animated about the question of lab leaks because at some level it's an academic question. We've got this virus. What's the best way to deal with it? Right. And the answer is no. This makes all the difference in the world, because what in effect is going on, if you think back to the Natural Origins paper, the Christian Anderson-led paper. So Christian Anderson interacted with Fauci behind closed doors in his email. Anderson argued that, in fact, the virus as they were coming to know it was inconsistent with evolutionary theory. It could not have come about naturally, and effectively a plan emerges to obscure that, and suddenly there's a reversal of course, and Anderson and his academic cronies cook up a paper that says this virus has to have come from nature. It couldn't have come from the lab, and here's how you know. And their argument is nonsense. Their argument is we would not have known that the structure we see would be any good at infecting people, Therefore, we wouldn't have planned it this way. If people were going to make a virus, they wouldn't have made this one, which is true. What they didn't say was that there's another mechanism, that we're not that good at doing things like describing a virus that's going to infect people. But what we're really good at doing is borrowing tools from nature, right? We borrow enzymes to do genetic engineering. We borrow antibiotics to fight off bacteria. We borrow evolution to solve problems we're not smart enough to solve yet. And so serial passaging was the thing that they were avoiding describing in that manuscript, right? So they do not say what we're going to do, or what likely has accounted for the existence of this virus, is that the virus, a ancestor virus, was passed from one individual to another, evolving along the way to answer the question, how would you make a pathogen for humans if you don't know enough to specify its molecular nature? So what that in effect does is it creates a virus with the characteristics that the people who ran the experiments wanted it to have, but it also has other characteristics. So at the same time, they were selecting for the capacity to infect human tissues, they were also selecting for what I would call explorer modes. They were selecting for a virus that was experimenting. Furthermore, if you think about the question of what virus we ended up with, you know, you and I, Heather, have been very careful not to fall into the trap of saying this isn't a dangerous virus. Right? From the beginning, we talked about the fact that actually this is quite a scary virus, and that the level of danger is not captured in the comparatively low case fatality rate. Right? There seems to be lots of harm done around the body that isn't captured there, which, you know, my telomere work suggests is going to accelerate aging and shorten lives. So then the point is anything about what makes this virus actually dangerous the result of the mechanism used to generate it? And the point I want to make is, let's say that you used ferrets, which have an ACE2 receptor similar to humans, in order to get evolution to solve the question of how you take a virus poorly adapted to infect humans, the ancestor virus to SARS CoV-2, and get it to be really good at infecting humans. So ferrets are a likely serial passage organism. So-called humanized mice that have been altered so they are molecularly more similar to humans, are a likely place for serial passaging, and human airway tissue, which can be purchased and basically uses evolution to solve the question of how to get from cell to cell in human airways. So all of these things are places where evolution could have been used to solve this puzzle. But what will happen? Let's take the ferret example. In nature, a virus that infects a ferret needs to leave the ferret capable of doing ferret stuff in order for the ferret to spread the virus to others. Otherwise, you remember the R naught term, how many cases can an individual case spur? If a ferret is only capable of infecting its, family members in the burrow, and it's not going to encounter other ferrets in the population,
and neither are they.
Right, then R naught is going to be less than 1 and the thing will go extinct. So that's not a successful plan. So the point is, there's certain pathogens that don't work this way. Malaria, for example, knocks you flat on your ass. Why? Because you're not spreading it, mosquitoes are. So you being so exhausted.
The analysis is different with a vectored pathogen.
Right. Because if you're lying down and you can't swat a mosquito, then the mosquito is in a good position to pick it up and move it.
And the analysis will be different with a waterborne. And, as everyone, became familiar with and probably mostly forgot the difference, it's going to be different for aerosolized versus airborne. For, foam-like transmission, mode of transmission, vector versus not, all of these are going to have different predictions that come along with them about whether or not you expect virulence to evolve to be a pathogen to become more virulent over time in a population or less. Population density, of course, as well.
So if you're going to use laboratory serial passaging, what you are doing is you are actually creating a route that the pathogen couldn't go through in nature. And I would just point to several features of this virus that are probably far worse by virtue of the fact that serial passaging is the likely explanation for where they came from. Critically, if a pathogen, in order to get from one individual to the next, let's say a respiratory pathogen, requires you to be mobile, so you can't be terribly sick, right? Then trade-offs being what they are, it has an incentive not to do any damage to tissue that isn't directly involved in transmission, right? To the extent that you have tissues that aren't capable of spreading the virus because they're not exposed to the outside world, and everybody who contracts the virus is getting it from a respiratory source, then the point is, well, that reduces your mobility without increasing transmissibility. So nature wouldn't do that. On the other hand, if you've got ferrets caged together where they don't have to find each other and they don't have to, look healthy, right? Imagine, creatures in nature are liable to have a revulsion for individuals of their species who look sickly, right? It's natural that you would evolve that because, of course, not every sickly individual has something transmissible, but a lot of them do.
Yeah.
And so sickly individuals are something to be avoided. But if you're caged with a sickly individual, your preference to avoid them doesn't matter because you can't avoid them. So lots of things about this, maybe even anosmia, right? To the extent that a ferret, in order not to starve to death, has to depend on its extraordinary sense of smell, right? A virus that disrupts that extraordinary sense of smell is immediately going to cause a foraging problem for a ferret.
Yeah.
But not in a cage where the ferret eats ferret kibble, right? So you could get things like anosmia, which wouldn't naturally be likely to happen because the ferret needs to be ecologically capable.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, there might be two different possible approaches. Like anosmia might be adaptive in this situation and not in a normal ferret situation, or and this seems far more likely the one that you've proposed, anosmia might be acceptable and not come with the normal cost in this situation that it would in a wild ferret population.
Right,
situation.
exactly. In this case, anosmia is annoying. It's not obvious that it has long-term implications, but the point is it does seem conspicuous, right?
Yeah.
Much like a virus that can only be transmitted indoors. Well, that also seems like an arbitrary laboratory phenomenon potentially.
That one strikes me more like it's about effective volume, and I think most viruses that are sort of airborne, aerosolized, are going to at least have a strong, be much more likely to transmit indoors. Although the degree to which that is true for this one does seem extreme.
No, I agree that it'll be more likely for any respiratory virus that is not fomite transmitted, but the degree to which it is true in this virus is conspicuous for something that supposedly came from the wild.
Yeah.
And of course, the point is trade-offs are under all of this. So if you can borrow from outdoor transmission without a cost because you're in caged animals, then you will tend to borrow in that and you will get something on some other characteristic that, we don't know. The two are connected.
Yep.
But anyway, this one, it may be that the laboratory origin actually worked for us because it left the outside environment a place that one could actually be safe, if not for bad CDC advice and things like that.
Well, but for the laboratory origin, we wouldn't have it at all. So you don't want to go down that road too far. You can't.
No, I started by saying if laboratory origin, then effectively you've got everything downstream of COVID belongs on their bill.
Yes.
Even worse, to the extent that people then took a crisis that we could potentially have ended if we had behaved in a coordinated and smart fashion and decided to utilize it for other purposes.
Yeah, right? Some people made bank.
Well, not even made bank. The point is, let's say that this was a mild disease. Let's say that this was somewhere between cold and flu. Okay. The cost to humanity, in fact, even the number of deaths is incalculable if you're stuck with it forever. Right. And so the point is the costs of this
even
virus.
If that was it.
Even if that was it.
Yeah.
Okay, we had flu and now we got another one. Right?
Yeah.
That is a disaster. And for anyone to have used this for their own purposes and at the same time run out the clock that was running on us actually controlling the thing is, it's diabolical.
Yeah. And go on.
Okay. So let me just close this out. So you've got various characteristics that may these are hypotheses, may be connected to serial passaging in a laboratory environment that is not like nature. One of them is the exploratory nature of this pathogen, right? The tropism for different tissues is high, and it may even be that its ability to jump species is high because it's been run through, some training courses.
Tropism you're using in a way that I'm not familiar with. It's a different definition than in botany, although maybe it's an affiliation for effectively.
Right.
Okay.
So phototropic, the tendency to seek the light. Tropism in this case means its ability to affect different tissues. Yeah. In effect, there is a constraint on a natural virus. Don't infect tissues that don't help spread the virus, so that you leave the animal as healthy as possible so it can go around and do the spreading. Mm-hmm. In this case, if you've got, animals caged so that they don't have to be any good at being animals, right? They're just cellular environments, then you lift a constraint. And the question is part of the large number of tissues that seem to be negatively impacted by this virus the result of the fact that it was in a highly unusual circumstance in which animals couldn't get away from each other? If that's what happened, then the point is much of the harm that comes to an individual who gets sick with this may be the result of its unnatural origin. And so, in effect, all of the explanations that say, look, okay, if it came from a lab, we need to know that so it doesn't happen again, but short of that, none of this matters. No, it all matters. And what you really need are people who are informed enough and insulated from the incentives that they can actually have a conversation about how much harm came to humanity from which errors, right? And the errors just continued to compound.
Well, or you could make the founder of EcoHealth Alliance the lead on the investigation of what the origin of SARS CoV-2 was for the trip to China. I mean, that seems like there's no conflict there. No,
you could just tell him that he's got a new job, and his new job is to find out whether this came from the lab, and I'm sure he would,
His new job is to see if he's a criminal in a past life, which is to say a current life.
This is cool. This is next level criminal investigation, where the people who do the investigation are the people who are in the best position to do it by virtue of the fact that they committed the crime and therefore know exactly
what happened.
They're
in nearly complete possession of the information necessary to prosecute.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost meritorious.
Excellent.